Hello, and welcome to your for loops lecture. So in previous lectures, we talked about the while loop, which basically runs by checking a condition similar to an if statement. The while loop continues to check a condition and runs until that condition is false. That works great in situations, especially when you don't know how many times you want to run something. For instance, we might want to run a password asker until someone gives us a good password, and we don't know whether that's going to take 1 or 74 tries. The while loop really helps us accommodate that. But what if we're in a situation where we know exactly how many times we want to run something? For instance, maybe I want to greet all of you. For each person in the class, I'd like to go up to them and say, "Hi, how are you?" Well, even if I don't know the number of people that showed up to class exactly this day, I know how many times I want to run that process. I want to run it once per person in our classroom. Now, in Python, we could finagle a while loop to do this, but we have another tool that might be more helpful, the for loop. The syntax for a for loop is for some variable name that we choose in some collection, do something. And that something is whatever we want to do once per item in the collection. Notice, like an if statement, an else, a while, we're using indentation to tell Python which code specifically goes with this for loop. Now again, this is a lot easier to see when you can see actual code, so let's go to Atom and try some of these out. So the syntax for our for loop is pretty simple. We're going to say the word for, some temporary variable, we'll go more into this when we go to Atom, in some type of collection. Like if statements and while loops, for loops have code indented under it to indicate what code is part of this for loop. In this case, the code under the for is going to tell us what will run for each item in the collection. Before we head off to Atom, let's talk a little bit about collections. So far, the two collections we've learned a lot about are strings, which are collections of characters, and we can also get a collection of numbers using the range function. For instance, range 0 to 10 would give us 0 through 9. Some other collections we briefly talked about, but haven't dived into deeply, are lists, dictionaries, and sets. Anytime we have a collection, we can loop through it in some way using a for loop. All right, let's go to Atom and check out some examples. Okay, let's start with a very simple for loop. We're going to say for I in range 0 to 10, print I. Now notice all of the parts of our for loop. We have the for, we have some variable name, in, and then a collection. In this case, it's all of the integers between 0 up to but not including 10. Now, this I is just a variable name that you want to work with. We could call this bananas, B-A-N-A-N-A-S. We could call it gosh. We could call it Frank. Whatever we want to call this variable is absolutely fine. It's just the name that we're going to use to reference whichever item in the collection that we're currently iterating through. So, for example, let's run this loop. Say Python for loops blank, beautiful. So when we run this, you can see that the output was to print every single integer from 0 all the way up to, but not including 10. So I'm going to make this a little bigger, but as you can see, when we first start our for loop, I is equal to the first item in the collection, 0. Then, once it's completed all of the code in the for suite, it's then reiterating and incrementing to the next item in the collection. In this case, that's 1. So now I is equal to 1. Then we print it out, iterate again, I is now equal to 2, then 3, 4, 5, all the way up until it's equal to 9. This is exactly how for loops work. We take a collection and the temporary variable I that we've created equals each item in the collection successively. All right, let's try another for loop that's similar but a little more complicated. This time we're going to say for I in range 1 to 10, and that is going to give us a collection of all of the integers from 1 up to but not including 10. This time I want to print out whether a number is even or odd. So I'm going to say if I modulo 2 equals 0, so if 2 goes into that number evenly, print even, else print odd. Now notice, remember, I is going to change what its value is depending on which iteration we're on. For the first iteration, I is going to be 1, then it's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up until 9. All right, let's go ahead and run our code and see what the output is. Cool. So we can see that when our for loop started with 1, that's an odd number, so it printed out odd. 2 is an even, 3 odd, 4 even, 5 odd, etc., all the way until 9. All right, now let's try looping through a string. So we are going to say for letter, and again, this could be any variable you want, but since we're looping through a string, letter makes sense. In Humu Humu Nuku Nuku Apua'a, which is the name of a fish from Hawaii. So this is going to loop through every single character in this string. And we want to count how many H's, U's, M's, K's, A's, and N's there are. To do so, let's use a series of if and elif statements. First, we'll say if letter equals H, then H count plus equals 1. So if it's not H, elif letter equals U, U count plus equals 1. Elif letter equals M, M count plus equals 1. So basically we're going through all of these different letters, and if the current letter we're iterating through is equal to that letter, we're going to up the count of that letter. I'm going to go ahead and finish this for K, A, and N. All right, so I've gone ahead and finished all of my if and elif statements, and you can see here that it's going through each letter and incrementing the counts just as we talked about. If for some reason we find a letter that's not either H, U, M, K, A, or N, then our loop will print out, what are you doing here? All right, once our for loop is done, we probably want to see the results of all our counting, so I'm going to go ahead and print out all of those different counts. Great, let's go ahead and run our code. Okay, so you can see that in our string, Humu Humu Nuku Nuku Apua'a, we are having 2 H's, we are having 9 U's, we have 2 M's, 2 K's, 3 A's, and 2 N's. We also had 1 P, which wasn't counted, and therefore our loop printed out, what are you doing here? We haven't learned a lot about lists yet, but I do quickly want to show you how to use for loops with them because they're incredibly useful. For instance, instead of using the range function, I've created a list here of all of the integers between 1 and 12. Let's use a for loop to only print out the numbers in this list that are divisible by 3. So we can say for n in nums, so that's again for variable in a collection, this time the collection's a list. This is going to go through each item in the list. So for n in nums, if n modulo 3 equals 0, so if it's divisible by 3, print this is divisible by 3. So let's go ahead and comment out our other code and run this. Okay, you can see that when it printed out, it said this is divisible by 3 4 times, probably for 3, 6, 9, and 12. We can also do this for lists that contain other items, for instance, strings. I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, maybe I wanted to greet a bunch of people. Well, maybe I want to greet every single person that's named in this list. I can do that with a for loop. I can say for name in names, print hello plus name. And then let's add an exclamation point just to make it sound happier. When we run this, it's going to iterate through each item in the list. In this case, each item is a string with a name. So first, name is going to be equal to Abby, then Billy, Catherine, Devin, Elon, and Fred. Let's see what the output of this program looks like. Awesome, so you can see we have greeted everyone: Abby, Billy, Catherine, Devin, Elon, and Fred. We'll talk more about these when we actually get to lists, but I thought that was good to point out now that you can use lists with for loops, and in fact, they're very helpful. So we learned about continue and break when we were talking about while loops, but they can also be used in for loops. They work exactly the same way. For instance, a break, if you hit one inside of your for loop, will finish the loop entirely. It will not iterate through any of the remaining items. A break means we're done, stop now. A continue, on the other hand, means skip this iteration, but check on the next one. In a for loop, this would mean that we skip the current value that we're on in the collection, but we move on to the next one and continue as normal. All right, let's look at a way we can use continue with a for loop. Say I irrationally hate the letter E, and I have a string, the bee's knees, and I want to print out every character, but not if it's an E because I hate them. Well, I can loop through all the characters in my string using a for loop. So for instance, for L in my string, and if that character is equal to an E, so if L is equal to lowercase e, or L is equal to uppercase E, then I'm going to say continue. This is because I don't want to do anything else if the current letter is an E, because I hate E's and I don't want to work with them. But if it's not an E, then I want to print it out. So I'm going to say print current letter, and then plus the actual letter we're on. All right, let's run this hopefully E-free code. Beautiful. So you can see that it printed out every character in our string except those that were E's, which is exactly what we wanted to do. Remember, continue just stops the current iteration of a loop. It doesn't prevent the rest of the loop from running. What if we really hated E's so much that as soon as we saw one, we were just done? We didn't want to do anything else. Well, we could use a break statement. Let's see how the output is different here compared to when we used a continue. Cool, so you can see a break is much stronger than a continue. When we saw an E, we stopped every iteration of the for loop. We didn't continue on. With a continue, when we saw an E, we got a little upset. We didn't finish that iteration, but we continued on with the next one, so on and so forth through the entire collection. All right, that's all I have for you. I will see you next time.